We began last week to discuss those additions to the tefillah that are around and about Geshem. And of course, today, starting with Ma'ariv of last night, we began asking for Geshem. The Gemara in Brachos on Daf Chavtes quotes Rav Tanchum in the name of Rav Asi. And according to this tradition, if somebody omitted what's called Gvuras Kishamim, Haskaras Kishamim, Mashiv Baruch Mordei Goshem, Machzir Noso, which means that if he's still saying Shmon Esrei, he goes back to the beginning of Shmon Esrei. And in some cases, if he reminds himself before Machayam Mesim, he goes back to the bracha of Gvuros. With regard to someone who omits Bakoshas Kishamim, the same Talamot Levracha, the Gemara says Ein Machzir Noso. Why? Because Yesh Lo Takana. He can include the same Talamot Levracha in Shomei Tefillah. So the Gemara asks, the Brisa says against Rav Asi that if someone was Toeh and Birchas Hashanim, Machzir Noso. We have what seems to be a contradiction between Rabbi Tanchum and the name of Rav Asi. He says if you left out Birchas Hashanim, the same Talmud Levracha, then Ein Machzir Noso. And yet, the Brisa says that if somebody made a mistake and he left out Birchas Hashanim, Machzir Noso. So the Gemara reconciles this contradiction by saying the following: that the Brisa and Rabbi Tanchum are talking about two different cases. The Brisa that says that Machzir Noso, that's a case of someone who's davening b'yochid on his own. Whereas Rabbi Tanchum, in the name of Rav Asi, is talking about someone who's davening together with the tzibur, and therefore Eino Choser. He does not have to repeat Shmon Esrei. Now the Gemara says, what's the difference between someone who's davening b'yochid and someone who's davening b'tzibur? And the Gemara says the takana of somebody who's davening b'tzibur is that he can be yotzei by hearing the same Talmud Levracha in the Tfilas Hashatz. So the Gemara says the following. I don't understand, says the Gemara. You're telling me that according to Rav Tanchum, Ein Machzir Noso is because of the Shliach Tzibur. Rabbi Tanchum himself says Ein Machzir Noso mishum sheyachol liyomer b'shomei tefillah. Why are you being more chacham, more of a smart aleck than Rabbi Tanchum himself? You're explaining that Rabbi Tanchum is talking about a case where he's davening b'tzibur and therefore be yotzi through the shots. Rabbi Tanchum offers his own explanation as to why Ein Machzir Noso if he left out in Birchas Hashanim, and the answer is because he can say it in Shomei Tefillah. We'll see the Gemara's answer as we go along, but first we want to take a break. One of the commentaries on Masechta Brachos is the Melo HaRoim. And he says the following: the Gemara answers that Rabbi Tanchum is talking about a case where he's davening b'tzibur. That's why Ein Machzir Noso. Says the Melo HaRoim, I don't understand. If he's davening b'tzibur, then why can't he hear Mashiv Haruach Mordei Goshem from the shots? The Gemara says, no one questions it, that if he leaves out Mashiv Haruach Mordei Goshem, Machzir Noso. In contrast, if he leaves out Mashiv Birchas Bakoshas HaGshamim, the same Talmud Levracha, Ein Machzir Noso. But the Gemara interprets that Ein Machzir Noso because he's davening b'tzibur, and it'll be yotzei with the bracha of the shots. why not apply the same principle, asks the Mullah Rowan, to Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen? If he left out Mashiv Ruach Goshen, the Gemara says hands down that he has to repeat Shmon Esrei. Why not be Yotze with the Shliach Tzibur? Furthermore, asks the Mullah Rowan, I don't understand the Havamina of the Gemara. The Gemara has a Havamina to say that if he omits the same Talmud Levracha, and Rabbi Tanchum says Eino Chozer, that's because he's hearing the Tzibur. How could there be such a Havamina? That the logic doesn't make any sense. Rabbi Tanchum says the reason why Ein Machzir also if he left out the same Talmud Levracha is because of Shomei Tefillah. He's going to recite it and insert it in Shomei Tefillah. What was the Gemara even thinking? What was the Havamina of the Gemara? Now, in order to answer both of these questions, let's go over the two questions. Number one, if you're applying the principle of Tzibur, that should apply even to Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen, not just to the same Talmud Levracha. And secondly, how can you tell me that the same Talmud Levracha in Eimach Zirno so, according to Rabbi Tanchum, is because of the Tzibur, where Rabbi Tanchum says explicitly it's because of Shomei Tefillah? Like, what's the connection? And the Mullah Rowan wants to answer both of these questions with one fundamental distinction. And he distinguishes between Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen and the same Talmud Levracha. He says that Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen is a description of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Almighty God is described as Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen. And that's indeed why we inserted into the first three brachos, meaning Sheva. Says the Mullah Rowan, that is part of the Matbeah HaBracha. During this time of the year, when we describe the Almighty, we're describing him as Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen. If you omit that description, you have not glorified and praised God. And it's as if you left out the entire bracha. Now we have a principle which he invokes, is kilu dileges habracha. If he makes a fundamental change, deviating from the standard formulation of the bracha, the way it was formulated by Chazal, then it's as if he left out the bracha. And Tosfos, in a set of brachas on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, writes that if a person omits a bracha, then he cannot be yotze with the shots. The shots, the Shliach Tzibur will help him for a toes. But if he was Meshanim Matbeah and he left out a bracha, the shots can't help us at all. Now that the Mullah Rowan has established that Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen is an essential part of the Matbeah bracha, and if you omit it, it's as if you had omitted the entire bracha. Now we understand very well why the shots is not going to be able to help him, because Tosfos says the shots cannot help you if you left out a bracha, if you skipped a bracha. However, Rabbi Tanchum, in the name of Asu, he's talking about a different issue. He's talking about the same Talmud Levracha. He's talking about a Tosefes Tefillah, meaning an addition to our Bakosha. Not to be equated with Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen, which, as we said before, it's an essential part of our Shevach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's our description of God, in which case he's Meshanim Matbeah, he's missing the essence of the bracha, Ki'ilu Dileg. No, comes along Rabbi Tanchum in the name of Rav Asi, he says, Ad Kan Mashiv Ruach Mordad Goshen. But as far as V'sein Talmud Levracha, that's a Tosefes Tefillah. It's an addition to our bracha tefillos, and it's not the guf hamatbeah brachas. It's not the essence of the formulation of the bracha. There are many, many parts to that bracha, which we ask for parnasa from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, including during the rainy season, asking for rain. That he calls the Tosefes Bakasha. So when they organize the tefillah, and there are various bakashos, and in the ninth bracha we mavakesh parnasa, they added during the rainy season that we should mavakesh for the rain. And now we're going to prove it. The halacha is that if you, says Rab Tanchum, you left out the same talamatul bracha, you can add it to Shomei Tefillah. How do you add it to Shomei Tefillah? You can't add a bracha that you omitted and you skipped and inject it into Shomei Tefillah. Shomei Tefillah is an all-inclusive bakasha, and you can add bakashos. And now there's a perfect match. Says Rabbi Tanchum, if you omitted bakashas kishamim v'sein talamatul bracha, I got an eitzah for you. You don't have to repeat Shmona Esrei. Wait till Shomei Tefillah. That's a great place to add a bakasha. So you have an obligation to add a bakasha for Geshamim. If all things are ideal, you will integrate that bakasha into the fabric of the ninth bracha for Parnasa. But if you didn't do so, we have a very good eitzah, a very good recommendation for you. You missed a bakasha, put it into Shomei Tefillah. And Rabbi Tanchum therefore is implying that if the bakasha of Geshamim, Shelas Geshamim, was an essential part of the Matbea bracha, then it would be as if you omitted the entire bracha. That's Mishana Mimatbea Shetovu Chachon. You don't have an option of adding it to Shomei Tefillah. We now can shed a light on not only the first question that the Malor Rom asked, why shots will help you for the same Talamatul Vroch, but not for Masha Baruch Mordagoshem, because as we said before, Tosfos says that there's no takana, you can't fix up through Chazor Sashatz if you skip the bracha. But Chazor Sashatz will be meaningful if you skip the bakasha, which is a Tosefes bracha, and it's not part of the essential matbea shel chachamim. Now we can answer our second question. Why did the Gemara have a halamina that according to Rabbi Tanchum, if he left out the same talamatul bracha, he can fix it up through the shots? What do you mean fix it up through the shots? Rabbi Tanchum says that he fixes it up through Shomei Tefillah. Says the Malor Rohan, the Gemara wants to prove that the same Talamatul Bracha, as opposed to Masha, is not part of the Guf Nusach HaBracha. It's not part of the Matbea Bracha. It's a Tosefes Bakasha. How do we see that? From the very fact that Rabbi Tanchum established that in event that you forget to ask for Geshamim, the same Talamatul Bracha, you can put it into Shomei Tefillah. Chazinon, we see from that it's not part of the essential Matbea of the Bracha. If it was, you wouldn't be at all helped by Shomei Tefillah. It's got to be a Tosefes Bracha. So the Gemara says that if it's a Tosefes Bracha, then even if you didn't get a chance to add it to Shomei Tefillah, you have another fallback position. You can hear it from the shots. When do we exclude hearing it from the shots as a takana? That's in Masha Baruch Mordagoshem, which is part of my Matbea Bracha. And if you omit it, you skip that bracha, it's not going to help you to listen to the shots, as we saw in Tosfos. But in the case of the same Talamatul Bracha Bakashas Kishavim, which is not an essential part of the tefillah of the bracha, it's not Neshana Mimatbea, and I'll prove it to you from the fact that you can, in a fallback situation, add it to Shomei Tefillah. Therefore, you can be Yotzei from the Chazor Sashat. That is the essence of the presentation of the Malor Rom. So what bothered the Gemara after this beautiful presentation, explanation, Rabbi Tanchum, the Gemara wanted to know, why does Rabbi Tanchum invoke a raya? He should have said explicitly that Yochel Etaknal Yidei Chazor Sashatz. Why did Rabbi Tanchum say it in a way that we have to be medayek? We have to really analyze it and employ the thumb. If Rabbi Tanchum holds that you can add it to Shomer Tefillah, then you can be yotze with the shots. Why didn't he say directly, explicitly, that he can be yotze from the shots? And the Gemara, in answering this question, because we didn't get to the Gemara's answer, the Gemara says the Brisa and Rabbi Tanchum are both addressing the case of Mispalel B'Yachid. Rabbi Tanchum offered the option of Shomer Tefillah because there is no option. He's davening b'yachidus. Had he been davening b'tzibur, Rabbi Tanchum would have offered him a great option of being yotzei with the shliach tzibur. But since he's davening b'yachid, therefore he has an option of adding it to Shomer Tefillah. Had he been davening b'tzibur, then even if he missed Shomer Tefillah, he could still fulfill with the same talamot to the Bakashas Kishamim by listening to Chazoras Hashem. And this leads us to the Yeshuas Yaakov, which I mentioned last week. Once we see from the Maloah Roim that there's a fundamental issue about those additions to Shmona Esrei, like Mashav Ruach, Hazkaras Kishonim, and the same Talmud of Akashas Kishonim. One is part of the essence of the Matbei of Tefillah, and the other is a Tosefes Bakashim. In that light, and with that background, we can begin to understand the Yeshuas Yaakov. What happens if a person omits the same Talmud Livracha on Mincha of Erev Shabbos? He omitted Bakashas Kishamim. Does he repeat Shmona Esrei at Ma'ariv time, meaning on Shabbos? Now, on Shabbos, he's going to daven a bracha, a Shmona Esrei of 7 brachas. There's no option of asking for Geshamim. And therefore, the Yeshuas Yaakov assumes that in such a case, there's no Tfilas Tashlumin. The purpose of Tfilas Tashlumin is not going to be achieved. You want to now fill in for the Bakashas Kisham that you omitted. Well, I got news for you, buddy. You're not going to gain anything by adding a Tfilas Tashlumin on Shabbos because there is no Bakashas Kishamim in that extra Tfilah of Shabbos. Apparently, the Yeshuas Yaakov understood Bakashas Kishamim the same way that the Maloah Roim understood Bakashas Kishamim. Namely, that it's not part of the Guf Matbei Bracha, but rather it remains an external Chovas Bakasha, and if you omitted it, you'll have to repeat Shmona Esrei in order to be Makayim, to fulfill your obligation of Bakashas Kishamim. But on Friday night, when there's no option to fulfill your obligation of Bakashas Kishamim, because there is no place in the Shmona Esrei to fulfill it, then there's no point to Tfilas Tashlum. So let's just summarize what we have until this point. Based on the Maloah Roim's interpretation of the Sugya Brachas Chavtes, we establish a fundamental difference between Mashiv Haruach Mord Goshem, Hazkaras Kishamim, as opposed to Bakashas Kishamim of the same Talmud. The first is an essential part of the Matbei Bracha. The second is a separate, independent chova, an obligation of Bakasha. And now we have two nafkaminas. Number one, the Maloah Roim establishes that in the case of Machav Ruach, Mord Goshem, Hazkaras Kishamim, you will not be able to add that in Shomer Tefillah, nor will you be able to be yotze your obligation by listening to the shots? Why? Because that which is essential to the guf matbeat tefillah, v'shanim matbeat shetov v'chachamim, it's ki'ilu dileges habracha. If he left out the bracha, then there's no option to add it to Shabbat Tefillah. Nor is there an option of listening to the shots. In contrast, the same Talamot Levracha is a Chovas Bakasha unto itself, added to the Shmona Esrei during this period of time. And now we have two nafkaminas. Number one, if you omitted the same Talamot Levracha, you can add it to Shabbat Tefillah. And number two, if you didn't add it to Shabbat Tefillah and you happen to be lucky and you're davening b'tzibur, you can be yotze with the shots. Add to this another nafkamina. What happens if you omitted the same Talamot Levracha Bakash Shom in such a way that even if you added Tfilas Tashlumin to replace it, and the Tfilas Tashlumin is meant to give you an opportunity to be Mavakesh Kishamim, if that opportunity doesn't present itself, then it's pointless to daven at Tfilas Tashlumin. Hence, if he omits the same Talamot Levracha Mincha of Erev Shabbos, there's no Tfilas Tashlumin on Friday night, because he has to be Makayim his Chovas Bracha, to be Mavarech and Mavakesh Geshamim. He can't do so in his Tfilas Tashlumin on Shabbos, and therefore it's pointless. Now, if you have the pages, the Hegyonei Halacha on the bottom of page 400, he quotes a sefer called the Chesed Avram, Rabbi Avram Ta'omen. I'm not exactly sure how he's related to the Pri Megadim. I didn't get a chance to check that out. Anyway, the Chesed Li Avram disagrees with the Melo HaRoan. There's no difference, he claims, between Askaras Geshamim and Bakashas Geshamim. Neither of them are part of the Guf Matbea Bracha. They are both what we call additions to Shmona Esrei. One is a Tosefes Shevach, and the other a Tosefes Bakasha. The conclusion, therefore, of the Chesed Avram is that if you omit Masha Baruch V'Bordak Goshen, or for that matter, if you omitted, you failed to ask for Geshem of the same Talamot Levracha, Lo Batlak Tefillah. The Tefillah still remains a viable entity of Tefillah. So then he asks himself the obvious question. Why is it that if you made a mistake and you failed to be Maskir Geshamim, or you failed to be Mavakesh Geshamim, then Choser? Again, we gave options in the case of Akoshes Geshamim, but if he didn't have any of those options, if he remembered after he took his Akiras Raglayim and he's not davening with Tzibur and so forth and so on, then Choser, he has to repeat Shmona Esrei. Why? According to the Chesed Avram, these two, whether it's Hazkara or Bakach, are not part of the Guf Matbea Bracha. And the Tefillah, therefore, is not Batel. Says the Chesed Avram, that Chazorah, that he repeats the Shmona Esrei because he left out A or B, that's an opportunity that we give him because he forgot to add what he should have added, not because he hasn't done. His tefillah is a tefillah, but we have to give him an option of fulfilling his obligation of Haskara or Bakasha, and we're going to give him that option when he repeats Shmona Esrei. And there are two great nafkaminas now that come from this Chesed Avram. Number one, if, for example, he omitted Machav Ruach Morda Goshem on Mincha, at Mincha on Erev Shabbos. 1 second, I'm sorry. Sorry, forget about Mincha of Erev Shabbos. That was a mistake. If he omitted Masha Baruch Morda Goshen or the same Talamotu Livrocha, and he only finds out in the next Ona Spucha, his tefillah is not betela. We want to give him an option to fulfill that mitzvah, but that option might be limited to that Ona Satfila. But let's leave that on the side for a moment. My interest here is in the second nafkamina, which is on the top of page 401. And that is, if he made a tos in tefillas arvus, he forgot either azkara or bakasha in tefillas arvus. He says, Eino chozer. We're not going to give him another option to fulfill those obligations, even though there are other mistakes that would obligate him for another Shmoneh Esrei, because those obligations are based on a tos that are mevatel tefillah. Here the tos is not mevatel tefillah. They are both tosafot. Those are just added. So what's the difference between tefillas arvis and any other tefillah? In Shachris, or in Musaf, or in Mincha, if he omits Hazkara or Bakasha, he's got to repeat Shmoneh Esrei. Why not in Ma'ariv? So he invokes the sugya in Brachos Chav Zayin Tfilas Arvis Rishus, and that's how we paskin. But he says we accepted upon ourselves Arvis as a chova, but that's only as far as the Guf HaTfilah is concerned. We are obligated by virtue of our voluntary acceptance to daven Tfilas Arvis. If he left out Masha Baruch or the same Talamoto, he has davened Tfilas Arvis. He fulfilled the obligation that we were makabel on ourselves. However, lo kiblu aleim chova, they never accepted upon themselves an obligation of chazara to repeat Shmoneh Esrei in event that he left out a certain tosefes. So again, if he made a mistake in the guf habracha and his tefillah is not a tefillah, then even in the case of Ma'ariv, he hasn't fulfilled the kiblu aleim kechova of tefillas arvis. But if, on the other hand, the tefillah itself was a valid, viable tefillah, just that he hasn't fulfilled his obligation of azkara or bakasha, then there was never a kibul aleim kechova for chazara on Shmoneh Esrei, to repeat a second Shmoneh Esrei. And again, it's mind-boggling, because according to the Chesed Le'Avram, the halacha in general, with the exception of Ma'ariv, requires in certain cases, in certain scenarios, that I repeat the same tefillah twice in the same ona. The same tefillah, not Tashlumi, which is a different tefillah. The same tefillah. I would ask this as a quiz question to someone who is studying Hilchos Tefillah. Do we have in the constellation of Hilchos Tefillah a possibility of davening two Shmoneh Esreis of the same ilk in the same time period? Chakras once and chakras twice. Both obligatory, not a tefillas nidavah. And not a tashlumin because he didn't daven. So if he didn't daven properly and he made a major mistake, then he doesn't have tefillah, and now he has to daven. Here's a case where he fulfilled his tefillah. In brisket terminology, we would say he generated a chefza shel tefillah, and yet he's going to daven again. And the cases are where he left out either hazkaras geshamim mashma ruach or bakasha, so the same talamota. According to Chesed Le'Avram, he has daven. But we're going to give him an opportunity and even an obligation to daven again in order to fulfill that obligation. So he's davening the same Shmon Esrei of Shachris twice. Just that in the first one, he left out whatever he left out, Mashiach Ruach or the Saint Talamata. In the second, he filled it in. But in the case of Ma'ariv, where we were only Makabal Aleim Kichova one Shmon Esrei, we never accepted upon ourselves two Shmon Esrei. And therefore, if he omitted any of these, any of the Shamim, then he will not repeat Shmon Esrei. Very fascinating sheet of the Chesed Yom.
So I'm sorry, Rav, I don't understand. Wouldn't that go to Shachris if he had forgotten by Arvis? What is it? Why is it going from Mincha to Arvis?
There are two cases. One case is in Mincha, he left out one of these two Gishamim, we'll call it. And the other case is in Ma'ariv, he left one of those two out.
So is he answering the two in the case by Mincha, or he's only talking about when he forgot?
He's contrasting these two cases. He's saying they have two different halachic requirements. In the case where he omitted one of the Geshamim, either Bakasha or Azkara, in Mincha, go ahead and daven a second Shmon Esrei. Why? Not because your first Shmon Esrei was invalid, but in order to fulfill your obligation of Azkara or Bakasha. In the case of Ma'ariv, there is no obligation for a second tefillah. The first tefillah itself is really a rishus, just we accept it as a chol, but we never accepted this phenomenon of a second Shmon Esrei, the Chazorah Shmon Esrei. Okay. Now let's go back to the Yeshuas Yaakov again. This is on the bottom of your page 401. Yeshuas Yaakov quotes Rabbeinu Yehuda in Tosas Brachos Chavzai, in Tosas Brachos Chavav Amid Beis, and Rabbeinu Yehuda says that if he left out Yalav Yavu and Mincha and Rosh Chodesh, he will not repeat a second Shmon Esrei from Ma'ariv. It's already after Rosh Chodesh. V'yein toeles kedam. Says the Yeshuas Yaakov, by way of analogy, the same halach will apply if he omitted the same Talamata Livracha, Mincha and Erev Shabbos. Since Ma'ariv of Shabbos, he will not mention the same, there's no Bakasha Shamim, therefore, Ma'hoilim Chachamim, what will he gain by adding a Shmon Esrei? And as we pointed out before, this is a reflection of the conceptual understanding of the Malor Roim that we saw, that the same Talamot Livracha is a Tosefes Bracha, and just like Rabbeinu Yehuda in Tosfos understood and defined Yalav V'Yamam as a Tosefes Hazkara, but it's not part of the essence of the Tefillah, and therefore you will only repeat Shmon Esrei in the event that you omitted Yalav V'Yavu, if you could fulfill that obligation of Haskaras Hayom, meaning Haskaras Rosh Chodesh. So too, by analogy, says the Yeshuas Yaakov, if you omitted the Tosefes, Tefillah, and Bakasha of the same Talamot Livracha, we will allow you and require of you to repeat Shmon Esrei if you can fulfill that obligation, but that obligation remains like Yalav V'Yavu, external to the essence of tefillah. Now, the same Tosfos on Chavav Amid Beis quotes Rabbeinu Moshe, another one of the Balei Tosfos who disagrees with Rabbeinu Yehuda. I don't know if he was British. I don't know. He could be Chachmei Anglia because his name was Oliver. I don't know. Oliver Twist. Anyway, he came from a place called Oliver or Olive. I don't know. So Rabbeinu Moshe says that even if he doesn't gain anything by the second tefillah, like in the case of adding an extra tefillah of Motzei Rosh Chodesh, which doesn't have Yalav V'Yovo in it. Nevertheless, since he left out Yalav V'Yovo, he's obligated to daven a second Shmones. So the Hegyonei Halacha here, in footnote number 35, which starts on page 401, explains that the machlokas between Rabbeinu Yehuda and Rabbeinu Moshe revolves around the following issue. When the halacha requires that you mention Rosh Chodesh, Yalav V'Yovo, and he omitted Yalav V'Yovo, is that called tefillah? Has he fulfilled his obligation of tefillah? Rabbeinu Moshe holds, and this you'll see on the top of page 402, Eino Ololo. If on Rosh Chodesh he omitted Yalav V'Yovo, he has not fulfilled his obligation of tefillah. V'harei hu k'mi shelo espalel klal. And that too comes under Mishana mimatbeh shetovu chachamim b'bracha. Of a sheet in the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Moshe, that the chiyuv of mentioning Rosh Chodesh, which is derived from a separate drasha of Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, B'chol Yom V'Yom Tein Lo Mein B'chosov, that becomes part of the matbeh of the tefillah. Is Memela, in event that he omitted it, Mincha time or Rosh Chodesh, he will have to daven a second Shmoneh Esrei of a tefillas Tashlumin Ma'ariv on the second day of the month, when he cannot recite Yalav V'Yovo. But it doesn't matter because he's lacking the very tefillah that he was meant to daven, because now, according to Rabbeinu Moshe, Yalav V'Yovo as Karas Hayom is part of the Matbeh Shel Bracha. It's part of the essence of the tefillah. You would wonder, according to Rabbeinu Moshe, in a case of Yalav V'Yovo, whether or not he has the option, the fallback position of shots. If he's davening b'tzibur and he left out Yalav V'Yovo, could it be yotzei through the shots? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. I'm sorry. The answer would be absolutely no, I meant to say. Why? Because shots doesn't help you when you omit a bracha. And as far as the bracha of avodah is concerned, he omitted that bracha. Because according to Rabbeinu Moshe, if you omitted Yalav V'Yovo, it's Eina Ololo Uki'ilu Lo Espalel Klal. By way of contrast, give me a second here. Sorry. By way of contrast, Rabbeinu Yehuda in Tosfos is of the opinion that tefillah is tefillah and Azkara is a separate external obligation of mentioning the day. If he left out Yalav V'Yovo and Mincha, there's no point to adding another tefillah Ma'ariv time because it's already Motzei Rosh Chodesh and there's no opportunity to recite Yalav V'Yovo. So there's no din of Chazara unless you'll achieve that which you omitted. That's because Rabbeinu Yehuda understood that Yalav V'Yovo is external to the essence of the matbeh of tefillah. It's a separate chova that's independent of chova's tefillah. Whereas Rabbeinu Moshe understood that in a case of chovas hazkara, we change the Chazal change the very matbeh of the book. Hence, according to Rabbeinu Yehuda, there's no point to it. Tefillas tashlumin Motzei Rosh Chodesh because there's no Yal V'Yava. According to Rabbeinu Moshe, he hasn't davened yet. He has not fulfilled his obligation of tefillah, and hence he needs a tefillah's tashlum. Now, getting back to the lumdus that we presented here of the Yeshuas Yaakov, and then we want to get to Reb Chaim. The reason why, in the case of Mincha, Erev Shabbos, if he left out the same Talmud Levracha, there's no Tfilas Tashlumin, we said it's because, as the Yeshuas Yaakov formulates it, the same Talmud Levracha is a separate Chovas Bracha, Tosefes Bracha Bakasha, and he's essentially fulfilled his obligation of tefillah. The only point to tashlumin would be to ask for geshamah, which he cannot do in the framework of the tefillah on Leil Shabbos. However, here in the middle of page 402, he quotes a different angle of the Yeshuas Yaakov. The Yeshuas Yaakov now comes up with this, I'll call it a curveball, and he says the following. On Friday, he left out the same Talmud Levracha, and he doesn't daven Shtayim Arvos. And he writes, Yesh l'chalik bein tfilas hashloma b'motzoi Rosh Chodesh and tfilas hashloma b'Shabbos. What does this mean? The language here is very ambiguous. We'll try to bring it down to earth. He says the following. Let's go according to those poskim, like Rabbeinu Moshe in Tosfos, that if he left out Ya'aleh V'Yovo on Rosh Chodesh, Mincha time, now it's Motzei Rosh Chodesh, he will still daven another tefillah. That was Rabbeinu Moshe on Motzei Rosh Chodesh, Palestine. Says the Yeshuas Yaakov, herein lies another distinction between Ya'aleh V'Yovo on the one hand and the same Talmud on the other. Even if I would insist that you are mispal shtayim in a case where you cannot add the Ya'aleh V'Yovo that you omitted, like the case of Motzei, a Ma'ariv Motzei Rosh Chodesh, nevertheless, you would still agree with me, says the Yeshuas Yaakov, and accept my conclusion that with regard to the same Talmud Levracha on Mincha that you left out, Mincha, I need to say Mincha Erev Shabbos, there would be no second tefillah. So what that means is that, one second, let me just make the calculation. Oh, it means the following. That even if I accept Rabbeinu Moshe in Tosfos, that Ya'aleh V'Yovo is part of the Matbea, and therefore on Motzei Rosh Chodesh, I will add another tefillah if I left out Ya'aleh V'Yovo Mincha time on Rosh Chodesh, even if I accept that. And even if I would apply the same logic to the same Talmud Levracha, namely, that it's an essential part of tefillah, even that school of thought would agree, would concede, that if he omitted the same Talmud Levracha on Friday, he will not repeat Shmon Esrei on Friday night. And here comes the bomb of the Yeshuas Yaakov. He claims that the entire enterprise of Tfilas Tashlumin is predicated on and connected with another klal, another principle in Hilchas Tfilah, and that is called Tfilas Nidava. The reason why I can daven two tfilos in the same ona, meaning, let's say he left out Yalav Yovo, Mincha on Rosh Chodesh. Now it's Motzei, Rosh Chodesh, he's going to daven two Shmon Esrei. Both of them in the framework of Arvis, meaning nighttime, same ona. Why? How? How does that work? What's the magic here of Tfilas Tashlumin? Says the Yeshuas Yaakov, it is an extension of the fundamental principle that Halacha recognizes, the Torah recognizes Tfilas Nidava. Because Tfilos Keneged Karbanos Tiknum, just like in the world of Karbanos, there's a Karban Nidava, I can be no there to bring an Ola or a Shlomim whenever I'm no there, and of course I have to fulfill that chiyuv without violating Bal Tiacher, that's today's Daf Yomi. So too, in Tefillah, we have an exact corresponding halacha. We discussed this in the past, and that is a Tfilas Nidava. Once I'm empowered with the ability to stand up a second Shmon Esrei, after I already fulfilled my obligation of this ona, and the second Shmon Esrei will be defined as a Tfilas Nidava, then I can have Tashlumin. And the halacha is going to recognize as if that Tfilas Nidava replaces the Tfilas Chova that I omitted in the previous ona. Herein, says the Yeshuas Yaakov, lies a distinction between Rabbeinu Moshe and the case of Mincha Erev Shabbos. In the case of Rabbeinu Moshe, when we talk about Yalav Yovo, now it's the second day in Cheshvan, so I can daven at Tfilas Nidava, and if I can daven at Tfilas Nidava, and I've omitted Yalav Yovo on Rosh Chodesh, which means I'm lacking an essential part of my Be'er Bracha, I can daven a second Shmon Esrei, and that second Shmon Esrei is an extension of the power that I have to daven at Tfilas Nidava. But on Friday afternoon, if I left out the St. Talmud Levracha, Mincha time, and now it's Ma'ariv, now it's Shabbos, I cannot daven a second Shmon Esrei because that Shmon Esrei would have to be defined and classified as a Tfilas Nidava, and there ain't no such thing as a Tfilas Nidava on Shabbos. Why is there no Tfilas Nidava on Shabbos? Because there's no Karban Nidava on Shabbos. Wild, I'm telling you, so many chidushim, one after the other. You could publish a book just on these couple of pages that we studied today. And now we get to Reb Chaim. The Hegyonei Halacha is oblivious to an essay, which I thank you to David again, that I sent you from Harei Ked, Rav Michal Shirk. He has in front of him, the Hegyonei Halacha, what we used to call in our youth, Reb Chaim's stencil. They used to have stencils of chidushim of Reb Chaim. He calls it Kisvei Reb Chaim. It's really Kisvei Talmidei Reb Chaim. It's not the pen of Reb Chaim. And Reb Chaim also addresses the same question as the Baal Yeshuas Yaakov if he left out Bakoshas Gishamim Mincha Time Erev Shabbos. He quotes Rabbeinu Yehuda in Tosfos that in Yalav Yovel there's no point to a Tfilas Tashlumin after Rosh Chodesh because Ma Yo'ilu B'Takanosam. But he says that's because Rabbeinu Yehuda understood, as we said earlier, that Yalav Yovel is a separate, independent Chovas Hazkaras Hayom, independent of the very essence and the fabric of Tefillah. And his chiyuv Tefillah, even on Rosh Chodesh, that he omitted Yalav Yovel, is Kfar Yotzel Yidei Chovas. He has fulfilled his obligation of Tefillah. We'll give him the opportunity of another Shmon Esrei in order to fulfill his obligation of Chovas Haskara. But if there's no possibility of Motzei Rosh Chodesh to add Yalav Yovel, then there's no point to a Tefillas Tashlumin. Says Reb Chaim, not so in the case of the same Talmud Levracha. In this case, he will have to daven a second tefillah. And Reb Chaim here, unbeknown to him, is arguing against Yeshus Yaakov, against two svaras of Yeshus Yaakov. The Yeshus Yaakov, if you recall, had given two explanations why we would not have a tefillas tashlumin on Ma'ariv of Shabbos for Mincha when he left out the same Talmud, either because the same Talmud is only a Tosefes Bakosha, and it's similar to the pattern of Rabbeinu Yehuda and Yalav, or even if it's part of the essence, but Tfilas Tashlumin is predicated on Nidav, and there's no Nidav on Shabbos. Reb Chaim is arguing against both of these. Two premises of Reb Chaim. Number one, the same Talmud Levracha is part of the essence of the Matbei of Bracha. You left it out. You left out an entire Bracha. And if that be the case, then we're going to have to figure out Shabbat Tefillah. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But if that be the case, then on Friday night, there's no hesitation, there's no inhibition regarding a Tefillah Tashluma. You left out a Tefillah. You weren't Yotze your Tefillah. Mincha time, you have to repeat Shmon Esrei to make up the number of Tefillahs. And Reb Chaim is rejecting, as we understand it, rejecting the premise that you need an opportunity for Tefillas Nidav. And no, Tefillas Tashlumin is a Tefillas Chova, from soup to nuts, from A to Z. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Nidav. So he's rejecting the Shus Yaakov on two counts. Number one, he holds that the same Talmud Levracha is not just an addition to Shmon Esrei and a Tosefes Bracha and Tefillah and Bakosha. It is part of the essence and the matbei of the Bracha. And if he leaves out the same Talmud, it's Keilu Dileges HaBracha. And on the top of 403, Keilu Lois Palel Klal, Lo Yotze Yedei Choas Tfilas Mincha, Ubi Arvis Mispalel Shtayim. In contrast to Yalav Yavo, which is simply an external Chovas Haskaras Hayom, and therefore there's no second Tefillah, according to Rabbeinu Yehuda and Tosfos, on Motzei Rosh Chodesh. However, we don't understand, according to Reb Chaim, the sugya that we began today with, the sugya in Brachos Daf Chavtes that establishes, in the name of Rabbi Tanchu, that in event that you left out the same Talmud with Bracha, then you can add it to Shomer Tefillah. How can you integrate it into Shomer Tefillah? You left out a bracha. So now if you have the page from the Harei Keder, Rav Soloveitchik introduces another machlokas rishon. You know, sometimes if you don't know an answer to one question, you ask another question. We have a machlokas rishonim addressing the following issue. He omitted the same Talmud Levracha. If he had reminded himself before Shomer Tefillah, he would have integrated it into Shomer Tefillah. He reminded himself after Shomer Tefillah, before Akiras Ragel. Here we have a machlokas between Tosfos on the one hand and the Rambam on the other. What does he do in this case? Does he go back to Shomer Tefillah, or does he go back to the same Talmud Levracha? Tosfos says, let him go back to Shomer Tefillah. The Ran, at the beginning of Masechta Tainis, quotes the identical position in the name of Rav Hai Gon. So Tosfos and Rav Hai Gon before him are of the opinion that if he reminds himself after Shomer Tefillah, before Akiras Raglayim, he goes back to Shomer Tefillah and recites the same Talmud Levracha. The Rambam, on the other hand, Perek Yud Milchus Tefillah Halacha Tes, writes Chozer LeBirchas Hashonim. He goes back to the 9th bracha. It's not enough for him to go back to Shomei Tefillah. And the Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch, Simon Kuf Yud Zayin Sif Hey, as usual, paskins like the Rambam. What are they arguing? So now we have another question, and then we'll come back to our question about how Shomei Tefillah could be meaningful in a case where he left out the same Talmud Levracha, which means, according to Reb Chaim, he skipped that bracha. Ke'ilu lo ispalel bracha zukla. So the Rav postulates a breakthrough shita. In order to explain the Rambam. We start slowly. We go with Tosfos. And this you'll see on the bottom of the first side of your page, which is called Reish Samach Tes, at the very end of that page. Tosfos is of the opinion that She'ela B'Birchas Hashonim is external to the Chovas HaTfilah, meaning to the Matbea Shetavu Chachamim B'Tfilos. It's not Guf Matbea HaBroch. And that we've encountered that sheet in the past. That was the position, for example, Yeshus Yaakov and the Chesed Avram, who even applied that to Hazkaras Kishon. Anyway. If this be the case, then he has omitted a bakach. He recited the Shmon Esrei. He fulfilled his obligation vis-a-vis tefillah, even with regard to the 9th bracha, but he's obligated now to be mavakish geshamim. If he messed up on the first option, namely to be mavakish geshamim in its proper place, namely in Birchas Hashonim, then we give him a second option, a fallback option, but nevertheless a viable option to be mavakish geshamim shomei tefillah. If he forgot to add bakashas geshamim to shomei tefillah, okay, go back to shomei tefillah. You're still standing Shmon Esrei. Why go back to Birchas Hashonim and mess yourself up on all the brachas in between? You have an option of being mevakish geshamim in shomei tefillah. Take advantage of that option. Lechatchila, in an ideal sense, the proper place for bakashas geshamim is in Birchas Hashonim, Birchas Parnasa, the 9th bracha. But if you forgot it, you have another option in shomei tefillah. If you forgot it, shomei tefillah, go back to shomei tefillah. And now we turn to page Reish. And here we get the bomb, the revolution of the Rambam sheet. The Rambam holds that shomei tefillah has a special status in the constellation of the, we'll call it the 19 brachas of Shmon Esrei, but we're going to limit and restrict that special status. In other words, there's a certain magic to shomei tefillah, but it's a limited magic. It applies if X, but doesn't apply if Y. So let's talk about X. When do we have this magic of shomei tefillah? Shomei tefillah was established according to the Rambam Shita by Chazal as an option, a kind of joker card, if you will, in order to avoid repeating brachos of Shmoneh Esrei. Whenever we can avoid repeating brachos of Shmoneh Esrei, we're going to take a bracha of Shmoneh Esrei and insert it into Shomei Tefillah. Shomei Tefillah becomes, at one point, as I said before, a magical bracha, such that it lends itself to taking one of the other brachos and inserting it into Shomei Tefillah. And the Rav Zichron Livracha compares it to Tashlumin. Just like we have a magic of Tashlumin, and I can make up a Tefillah, Shomei Tefillah within a Shmoneh Esrei supplies me with the ability to make up a bracha. But here we have a restriction. When do we upgrade the status of Shomei Tefillah such that it can now lend itself to insert an entire bracha that was omitted? That's only if we won't have to add other brachos. We're in such a desperate situation because we're going to have to add other brachos. And now Shomei Tefillah is going to stand up to the plate, and it's going to allow us to pray the exact number of brachos that we need without having to add any other brachos. Let's see it inside. L'shitas haRambam ha'sheila b'berachas hashanim ze miguf nusach habracha, which means that it's guf matbei habracha b'shanim b'bei chachamim ki'ilu lo ispalel klal, as we saw. He was medalek, he left out Birchas Hashanim, that entire bracha was omitted because he left out Birchas, the same Talamot Livracha. But B'shachach Li'omra, if he forgot to repeat it in Birchas Hashanim, which means that now he's going to have to add new brachos, we want to avoid ribui brachos, and magically we gave an upgrade to the status of one of those brachos, maybe Shomei Tefillah, that in event that we can cut down the ribui brachos, we're going to use Shomei Tefillah. V'tiknu lo din shel tashlumin, a tashlumin for a bracha that he skipped. V'yochel lahashlim asher chiseh b'bracha. And again, you're talking about an omission of the guf matbei shel bracha b'birchas Shomei Tefillah. The Birchas Shomei Tefillah, because it's the end bracha of the Emtsayis, now opens up its arms, its gates, to accept a bracha that was omitted, so that he shouldn't have to add extra brachos. Kidei shelo yivarech brachos yiseros b'Shmoneh Esrei. And he has a parallel from another halacha of kibbutz golios. Maybe we'll talk about that later. I don't think we'll have time. I will be open. What happens if he forgot in Shomei Tefillah? That means that no matter how you slice the cake, you're going to have to add brachos, at least one, and maybe even three. Therefore, b'chaygavnu sheshachach gam b'Shomei Tefillah shebenkach ubenkach yitztorech lahosif brachos yiseus b'Shomei Esrei. He no longer has this upgraded status of a tefillah tashlumin and Shomei Tefillah, because that status was granted in order to allow a bracha at the end of all the brachos that could accept any of the brachos they omitted as a tashlumin. But now he's not going to save himself. He's going to have to, no matter how you slice the case, he's going to have to add brachos. Then Shomei Tefillah does not brag of that upgraded status of a tefillas tashlumin, and therefore we go back to the original takana. Where is the proper place? Where is the location of the bracha that's appropriate for bakashas geshamim? And that's going to be Birchas Hashem. Is therefore a miyushav in the bottom paragraph on the right side. Shitas agrach to be emes v'sein talamotu chelek mi Birchas Hashem. It's an essential part of Birchas Hashem. And that's why if you omitted mincha time on Erev Shabbos, you're going to have to repeat another Shmoneh Esrei on Ma'ariv. Avol mishalo hiskir, the same talamot levracha yeslo tashlumin b'Shomei Tefillah, because of that special status of tashlumin that's granted to Shomei Tefillah. Avol b'mi Shelo Zachar, Klal, the same Talamot Levrocha. If he completely forgot about it, and he's Mishanim Imadesh, Tomul Chacham Bibrachos, Chisa Miguf Birchas Hashonim, Havale Kalois Pal Klal, and even in event that he won't be able to add a Tfilas Tashlumin that encompasses the bracha for Shanim, the bracha for Gshamim, nevertheless he needs a Tfilas Tashlumin. But as far as going back to Shomei Tefillah, the Rambam Shitas, that's not an option. He's got to go back to Birchas Hashonim. Now, we skipped a little bit of a paragraph here about someone who left out kibbutz golios. He didn't mention that we are asking you, oh God, please gather together the exiles in Birchas Tkab Shofar, Tkab Shofar. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the name of Tkab Shofar as listed, enumerated at the end of Masechta Megillah, it's not listed as Birchas Tkab Shofar, it's listed as Birchas Kibbutz Golios. So forget about the shofar, talk about Kibbutz Golios. Let's get all the Torontonians here in Yerushalayim, right? He left out Kibbutz Golios in Tkab Shofar Gadol. And the Mechaber Paskins in Kuf Yud Zayin that he can recite his bakasha for Kibbutz Golios in Shomei Tefillah. And the essence of Tkab Shofar Gadol of that bracha is Kibbutz Golios. So obviously such a mistake is a real bad no, he crossed the red lines, and it's Ki'ilu Dileges HaBracha, and yet the Mechaber Paskins that he can insert it into Shomei Tefillah. Because the Mechaber Paskins that if he left out Birkas Bakoshas Geshamim in V'sei Talmud Tefillah, he can add it to Shomei Tefillah, which is Rabbi Tanchum in the Gemara in Brachos on Daf Chof Tes. And the reason is because Shomei Tefillah is this all-encompassing, all-embracing tashlumin for any bracha that he omitted. That only applies before he recited Shomei Tefillah. If he's already past Shomei Tefillah, then Shomei Tefillah is stripped of its unique character and its power and authority as a Tefillas Tashlumin. He's going to have to add brachos anyway, and he goes back to the proper bracha, which he omitted. He says, Yesh la'ayin, there's a rush at the beginning of Tainus in the name of the Rav Yah. Im siyem birchas hashonim, nizkar kodem shehizchil birchas tkab b'shofar gadol, yochol lishol shah. So he hasn't yet said Baruch Atah Hashem for the next bracha. He can simply recite the same Talamot Levroch. L'chora, that only makes sense if it's not part of the Guf might be a bracha, but according to Reb Chaim, who understood that the Saint Talmud is part of the Guf might be a bracha, he's already completed the bracha Birchas Hashanim. He's now adding a bracha of Bakashas Kishav and the Saint Talmud outside of the framework of Birchas Hashanim. How is that meaningful? He says, L'chora, Zerakim Ein Zeh Miguf HaBracha Shel Birchas Hashanim. Again, that would be a proof in favor of the Yishus Yaakov against Reb Chaim. El shetiknu chacham din sheila b'yalma v'kovus b'kov b'birchas hashanim l'zeh gam somach l'birchas hashanim l'achrea chashiv kisheila b'mkoma b'birchas hashanim. Aval l'fi amavur tavi cheli mitofas habracha tzarich iyun im yachol yomro liachar chasima shalom. We're not sure if we can reconcile Reb Chaim with this view of the rush in the name of the Rav Yah. That you could add the same Talamot Levracha right after Birchas Hashanim before Tkab Shofar. Nemar Gam Legabi Gvuras Kishamim. We find a similar halacha in Shulchan Aruch with regard to Gvuras Kishamim. Mashav Aruach Amor Goshen. That means you haven't started Birchas Kiddushas Hashem. You can add this Shavach of Morda Goshen. Avol, even though Shulchan Aruch brings that down, lo maisi lehacha ligabe v'sein talamot livracha. Why is it that this option that you, after you complete the bracha, you can still add the bakasha before starting the next one? And the Shulchan Aruch has that in the case of Mashav Aruch Maragoshem, but he leaves it out as an option in the same Talamot Livracha. Levad Zeda Mogen Avram v'chein HaMishnah Brura Maisule Ligabi v'sein Talamot Livracha Nami. Again, it's not in Shulchan Aruch, but it's in the later poskim. In Kain Ulai, perhaps you could say that the Shulchan Aruch leaves it out. L'shitase, he holds that She'el B'Birchas HaShonim is miguf habrach. And if you leave it out, it's as if you omitted that brach. Al Kain, therefore, lo shayach li'omer li'achar chasimas habracha shayni gevuras geshamim v'havi askara b'almon. So this paragraph should be connected to the beginning of this page, Reish Ayin, the first paragraph on the top of page, Reish Ayin, Ulam l'shitas aram shelu birchas Hashem is emi guf nusach habracha. And therefore, if he omits the same tal bracha, it's as if he omitted that bracha. Now we have to come on to Tfilas Tashlumin in Shomei Tefillah. And the Mechaber accepts the shitas Rambam. She'elo b'birchas geshamim is essential to the matbea bracha, and therefore he omits this chiddush of the Rav Yah that even after you complete the bracha, you can still ask for geshamim. Now, what we didn't get a chance to study here are pages 403 and 404, and in these pages, he speaks about the fact that in Chutz La'aretz, when we ask for Geshamim, we should add V'sabenu mituva, and that's the Gaon's Girsa. What's mituva with a mapikate? That always refers to Eretz Yisrael. So it means that the original tefillah for Geshamim was established in Eretz Yisrael, and in Chutz La'aretz we're going to continue the nusach that's really appropriate for Eretz Yisrael to indicate the greatness of rain in Eretz Yisrael.
That's still so smart.
Now, why is it that this is indicative of the greatness of Eretz Yisrael? Every land on the face of the earth needs rain. But the answer is that with regard to other lands, you can almost predict when the rain is going to come. It's part of the Seder Hateva HaKavua. It's built into nature and part of the cycle. Masha Ein Ken, in contrast, Eretz Yisrael, Ein Meinel Kvuim. And that's why the Pasuk says, Einei Hashem Elokecha Ba B'Reishis Hashana Achnis Hashana. God brings down the rains. In fact, the Torah in the 11th chapter of Dvarim contrasts Eretz Mitzrayim with Eretz Yisrael. And the Torah says, Ki ha'aretz asher ba shama l'rishta lo ke'eretz Mitzrayim hi. And how is that so? Because in Eretz Mitzrayim, tizra zaracha v'shkisa v'raglecha. Right? That you can expect the waters of the Nile to use those waters for irrigating your fields. But in Eretz Yisrael, in contrast, in the very next few psukim, the Torah calls it Eretz Harim because there's no water. Says that it's Dafka, this is the greatness of Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Hashem es Asher Hashem al Kech Dorish Osa. Says that it's what is the remez here? The word Dorish Osa, this you'll see on page 404, that Eino Nosei Lo Geshama LLP Drisha. It's our tefillos that bring down the Geshem. And Hashem designated this land for Eretz as Eretz Yisrael because the Matara Shamayim that's the source for Hashem bringing down the waters for vegetation and even for drinking waters, he said. And this is all a Tovas and Shal Yisrael, because if there's no rain, Chas v'Shalom, then that's a message from heaven that we got to do tshuva and set our ways straight. If there are rains, then that's a good sign from Shamayim. So this child in Russia apparently came into the Beis HaKnesses. It was on Shmini Atzeres. He saw that everybody was so passionately involved in asking Hashem for Geshem. So he turns to his father and he says, what do you mean, Dad? It's raining. What's all the passion? What's all the excitement about? His father says that Geshem Zeh Nenu Shalonu. That's not our Geshem. That's the Geshem of Russia. Our Geshem is not coming down unless we pray for it. And in the last paragraph here, as he ends this entire beautiful presentation, this essay, he says, when there's no matar, there's no Geshem coming down for Shamayim, it's an os for Simon, it's a message to us, She Yisrael, Einam Osim Ritzon Shel Makom, we have to do tshuva, we have to do Masakin HaMaisim, we need atfilos. He quotes Rabbeinu B'chai, Shamotu Netzar, Ein Tzar Gedol Mizu, Mitoch Tzar Zu Chozrim Lemutav Umispalalim. The absence of rain in Eretz Yisrael is meant to inspire us to tshuva and to tefillah. And therefore, all the psukim about rain in Eretz Yisrael fit into place. V'ayim Shemot Tishmol Mitzvos Hashem Elokeichem and Asati Mitar Artzachem V'ito. And the Hasidim used to say about tefillah, Mashiv HaRuach V'Morad HaGoshen. Ruach means the Ruach HaTorah. And if in Klal Yisrael the Ruach HaTorah is blowing strong, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Morid HaGeshem. He brings down the Geshem from Shamayim Kain, Yehi Ratzon. I want to wish everyone a great week and thank you. Thank you, sir.